The Florida Podcast Network, the voice of Florida.
From Mallory Square in Key West to the Governor's Mansion in Tallahassee and all points beyond, you're listening to the Florida Beer Podcast, powered by FloridaBeerBlog.com, your source for all things related to the craft beer community in the Sunshine State. And now your host, Dave Butler.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for another episode of the Florida Beer Podcast, powered by FloridaBeerBlog.com. This is Dave, your host and author. Thank you for joining us today. If you grew up in Tampa, along the banks of the Hillsborough River, on the other side of the river from Howard Blake High School, you may have noticed a rundown, large, two-story red brick building that sat unused for many, many years. At the beginning of the century, this was the waterworks plant, which actually supplied fresh water to Tampa, Ybor City, and the surrounding area. But as time went on, it fell into disrepair along with the close-by repair facility for the Ybor City trolleys, until former Tampa Mayor Bob Buckhorn envisioned it and the surrounding area for a magnet for visitors and locals alike. That vision was shared with the 1905 family of restaurants, and now you have Ulele in that location. It took a lot of years and it took a lot of capital, but turning this building from a former waterworks plant into a shell of its former use to an amazing Florida-forward restaurant and brewery has taken many people, many years, and it's great to see how much that has changed. Ulele is a particular favorite of ours. We try to go back there as often as we can when we are in the Tampa area, and it has absolutely no shortage of fans, which is nice. A lot of that is due to its Florida-forward menu. And when I say Florida, this is not Margaritaville. This is not beachside. This is pre-Columbian. This is what the natives, as close to what the natives ate as you could have in a restaurant setting. It is anchored by a huge on-stage grill where they love to grill freshly caught oysters and a very large array of seafoods, local meats. Definitely try the venison chili. It is absolutely fantastic. And all of that is partnered with a phenomenal brew house in the back. And we're going to chat with two people very familiar with all of this since they have been part of Ulele before Ulele was in existence. One of those is their brewmaster, Tim Shackton, friend of the podcast, friend of the blog, and a phenomenal man with several decades of brewing experience before moving down to be a part of the Ulele team. And the other is a particular friend of ours. This is Jeff Houck. He is the vice president of marketing for the 1905 family of restaurants. We've mentioned that name a few times already. Most people know that as Columbia. Columbia being the oldest restaurant in the state of Florida, having opened in, as you guessed it, 1905. He is also overseeing the other restaurants in that chain's portfolio, including Casa Santo Stefano, their new Italian focus, Cha Cha Coconuts, and of course, their first non-Columbia restaurant, Ulele. He's also the author or co-author of the Cuban Sandwich, A History in Layers, a book I very strongly recommend that you take a look at. So, we're going to chat with Tim and Jeff about the origins of Ulele, not just the person who created the story, but also the restaurant itself and why they decided to bring beer back into the 1905 family of restaurants umbrella. Enjoy.
It's interesting that you mentioned, this part of the 1905 family of restaurants. Obviously, everybody just knows Columbia, but I guess beer has sort of been in the blood of Columbia since Columbia got started.
Beer is part of the origin story for the Columbia restaurant. Back in 1903, the Florida Brewery in Ybor City, which was founded by Vicente Ybor, founder of Ybor City, started the Saloon Columbia right on 7th Avenue. Unfortunately, there was a fire and they had to relocate across the street to where the current Columbia restaurant is on 22nd Avenue and 22nd Street and 7th Avenue. But it was originally what people today would call a tasting room. When he built Ybor City, there were schools and housing and all kinds of things, barbershops, you name it, to make it a company town. And this was a vital part of it. The saloons were that outlet for the brewery. So, when you think about Ulele was originally a water plant, and that plant supplied water to the northern part of downtown and also Ybor City. So the beer that went to the Florida Brewery came from, the water came from here. The water that went to Columbia to make soups and stews and everything came from here. So it's really a cyclical story about how we converted this former waterworks plant into a restaurant that opened in 2014.
I find it interesting that it supplied so much water to Ybor because we're not exactly close.
We're closer than you think we are.
Really?
Yeah, we're sort of just outside in Tampa Heights on the edge of Ybor City. I'd say within about a half mile. But Casimiro Hernandez Sr., who was the founder of Columbia, was a brewer, and he worked for Florida Brewery. And so he and a partner had opened up the saloon, and then another partner, he opened up the Columbia Cafe at the time, and then slowly over the years took over the entire block between 21st and 22nd Streets. And, you can still go and sit at the original bar from 1905. I mean, it's that much a part of the origin story and the backbone of what Columbia eventually became.
Interesting.
So a few things about that. One, the Florida Brewery was actually revolutionary. It was the first artificially refrigerated brewery in the entire world.
Really?
Yes. So he was in a state-of-the-art operation at a period of time where production of the La Tropical label became the largest export of beer in the entire country. There was a lot of beer coming out of this town. One thing I like to consider, because, my own family was in Milwaukee at the same time. And that period of time when Prohibition happened was a very difficult time for brewers. Now at the Florida Brewery, they have a spring well on the property called the Government Spring. It's the same well that Teddy Roosevelt used when he came over with his Rough Riders, that they used to supply water to Fort Brooke all the way back in the 1840s when they were first building this town. Well, that well had gone bad, and I have it on a good testimony from my boss, our fearless leader, Richard Gonsmart, that Casimiro at one point had entertained sourcing direct for Florida Brewery from this property, and he had initially walked the property at one point. When Prohibition came, it changed. It was a catalyst that changed everything. And in the case of my family, there were thousands of brewers that were suffered up there in Milwaukee. Some even committed suicide as a result of the entire ruin of that economy. Well, a similar impact down here. All those operations closed. At the same time, it created a catalyst. The catalyst for the future that would become the Columbia restaurant and all that we see now. So out of some bad comes a lot of good. But I think about that time a lot because it directly reflects on how I approach recipe making.
Interesting. And obviously there's so much history in a lot of the things that you've just said. And, Columbia, I would say, had been around for decades. Can't just say years, but decades, grown throughout the state of Florida. why was it time for the Gonsmarts? Why was it time for 1905 to kind of come around full circle and not only create something that is very un-Columbia, but also to bring that brewing history back into the fold of the family, of the company, of the restaurants?
So Columbia now has locations, obviously, in Ybor City and at the History Center with the cafe and at the airport. But we're also in Sarasota with the oldest restaurant in Sarasota since 1959. And
Been there, love it.
in St. Augustine since 1983.
Been there, love it.
We're in Sand Key and Clearwater Beach. We're in Celebration. They are very well known for what they do and what they have done for 5 generations of the same family. And it's 121 years now. But there was a period of time in the 90s where the company was not doing well, and they had to kind of climb out of some financial deficit. They had to make the company financially healthy and then start reinforcing the current restaurants that they had. And then once the family was healthy enough, once the restaurant company was healthy enough, Richard was approached about doing this project by Mayor Bob Buckhorn, who was the mayor at the time in the city of Tampa, who wanted to redevelop this part of Tampa. It was essentially a blind spot. People would drive through this and past this to get to Seminole Heights, which was growing as a food area for Tampa. Tampa Heights was not known as a food area. So, Richard saw this. His father always said, if you have a chance to do anything on the water, do it. A lot of what you see here did not exist. The lagoon and the spring had all been covered up for the most part with dirt from, about midway through all the way to the seawall. This was an industrial building. It was not meant to be a restaurant. So Richard had gone to a restaurant in Montreal that was essentially native inspired ingredients and wanted to do a native inspired restaurant here at a time when local food was starting, the whole locavorism and farm to table thing was happening. He's like, well, we could do more than local. We could do indigenous. And part of that story is the beer story that flows through his family. And so, at the same time, the local food thing was happening, the explosion in craft beer was happening, the brew belt that goes from, essentially Sarasota all the way up to Jacksonville on I-4 and 95 was happening. And he's like, well, this is an absolute crucial part of our story. We should be a part of it. So, I don't know many restaurants that hire a chef and a brewmaster 2 years before we open, but the whole idea was every other brewery had food trucks outside, or every other restaurant had people that had an assortment of beers or local beers, but nobody really had their own brew house in the restaurant. And Richard wanted them to be seamless, where the food and the beers worked seamlessly together on the menu. They weren't meant to be add-ons for either one. And that's when he found Tim. And Tim brought that ethic of working with chefs and collaboration and making beers, that really appealed to a wide part of the bell curve.
Also, I could add, you said really it comes down to why. Why did he do it? And I can only tell you what he has told me personally. He has told me personally that one of the main motivations was his father, Caesar, had always said, if you get an opportunity to grab some property on the waterfront in the downtown area, you better get it. Number one. Number two, he has always told me for many years now, he's always wanted to come back to the neighborhood of his birth. He was born just a few blocks away from here. And so much more than all that we have just described was the birth of Ulele, and how we planted a seed on the river that would become a catalyst to create so much more commerce and prosperity for Tampa Heights, which has always, for many, many decades, been an at-risk area. So once we have Ulele open, the public and private partnership to put in all the millions to refabricate Waterworks Park, the federal and state dollars that were coming in for the planning for the Riverwalk. It was a project that they'd been working on through 3 or 4 different mayors across multiple generations, and it came to fruition after we opened. So now that continues.
And clearly this building was not just ready to go, let's move the restaurant in. I mean, it was what kind of a state did you find this in, and what kind of work did you need to put in there? Not just to put in a restaurant, but I know that putting in a brew system has its own separate construction issues.
The first time I met Richard Gansmart, I met him in front of the building that would become what you see it is now. It had been in a horrible state of disrepair for many years. The building was virtually condemned. Now, we entered the building and there were open fire pits. There were people who were living here who didn't belong.
This was not a let's go chill and enjoy a drink fire pit. This was
a brownfield. We had to dig up hundreds of truckloads of soil because of pollution to move all the bad soil out. And it was part of our mission to restore the spring and to restore this property to some semblance. We knew we couldn't make it a direct reflection of its former self, but the idea of the fusion of craft beer with craft culinary and a native-inspired menu was something to begin. Where to begin? Well, it's hard to say. A lot of times when you begin a journey like that, you just have to take a step. Sometimes you go in the right direction. Sometimes it's in the wrong direction. But ultimately, you have to continue to walk down the path. It took us over 2.5 years of planning. Lots of plates being pushed back across the table. Lots of moments where I had lots of time with our executive chef. What do we really mean to do? We're putting ferments on the table. We want to put them on the table. Why? To bring the plate closer to you. And how do you tie that in? It becomes a much longer discussion about the impact of what you're making. Understanding also the time differences. It's easy for a chef, if you overcook a steak, to put a new steak on the grill. The brewery works in a much different time frame. Sometimes I'm months or even years in advance. So at the same time, I've got the pressure to move forward aggressively. I've got the same counsel to plan for longer periods. It took a little while to get used to that, but now it's seamless after 11 years.
That's pretty awesome. And at what point in the creation was the vision for the restaurant aspect, not just the brewery aspect, but the restaurant aspect? Because it's very much Florida, but it's not, Margaritaville, Florida, and it's not, I don't want to say redneck Florida, but I guess I just did. This is very pre-Columbian. This is before Florida even existed. In fact, that's even where the name came from. When did that process really get started?
Yeah, so the concept was really driven by the story of Princess Ulele, which, according to legend, she was a Tocobaga Indian princess who saved the life of a Spanish explorer named Juan Ortiz. And he had been captured and she begged for his life. It's a story that sounds a lot like Pocahontas, but it predates it by about 80 years. So the spring, which had been called Magby Spring, was renamed in her honor in the 80s after a campaign by an Eagle Scout. And so when you think about the Tocobaga Indians, as I said, we were talking about local food. Well, we were talking about indigenous food. What did the indigenous people eat here? They had a lot of shellfish. They had a lot of seafood. What were the foods that the first European explorers brought? Well, first people that brought pigs to North America came through Tampa. So,
really,
yeah. And the cattle and everything that came, all the livestock that came with them, were huge inspirations. You had things like the datil pepper, which is a very Florida pepper that came by way of the Europeans. And it's so Richard really wanted to reflect that and to go deeper indigenous instead of just local. But I've accused him of making this restaurant so he could have char-grilled oysters and a double-bone pork chop, and he hasn't refuted it. But, it continued to develop along the way, and we've kind of had dishes that are come and gone. But the oysters and the shellfish are absolutely crucial to the menu side of it, the way the beer is on the beverage side of it. Even the wine list is of domestic family wineries. We have a little bit of European that comes from the family's Spanish side, but they're all domestic family-owned wineries because we are a fifth-generation family-owned restaurant company. So story and history are sort of like the flavor that nobody else has that we can tell in an authentic way.
And how difficult is that to create a lineup of beers that honors a tradition like that? Because I don't think the Tocobagas had beer.
You're correct in that assumption. But the journey for me began in understanding that Ulele was a real person. She is a historical consequence to our area. There are scribe accounts in the conquistador publications from all the way back in the 1520s and 30s that give firsthand experience to meeting with Ulele, to discovering Juan Ortiz after 12 years of captivity.
So this was not just a myth.
No, this is absolute fundamental real thing. And one of the things I understood about the journey of discovery was two sides to every coin. The magnificence and brutality of the warrior caste of both sides of the coin. The Tocobagans had the equivalent of the English longbow. They could pierce the armor of the conquistadors. Nowhere else in the historical records in the entire side of the world did they have weaponry like that. The Tocobagans did. They absolutely put a brutal fight against the conquistadors. On the other side of the coin, there were conquistadors that were not exclusively interested in the pursuit of gold. And some of those, like Hernando de Soto, who 12 years after Juan Ortiz was taken captive, landed with his fleet, discovered Juan Ortiz, and he had been taken care of because Ulele had released him from his servitude to the Tocobagans, to another tribe. Ironically, the chieftain of that tribe was at war with Hirahigua, Ulele's father. But he must have been hopelessly in love with Ulele because he took Ortiz in for 12 years. He came out, they discovered him, and he treated that tribe like royalty. He lavished them with gifts. So there's two sides to every coin, and that's part of the journey of discovery. I think about all of these things when I think about beer. And you ask about beer, and I think a lot of it has to do with historical precedent. How do I lend credence and authenticity to saluting the past in my own way? I come from a family of brewers. The brewing process birthed in the beer halls of Munich. It's very special. Cold fermentation, lagering, krausening, all these things create such a high quality product. It's very difficult to make. So there's a reason why these types of beers are so highly sought after, and how the launching of that lager revolution pretty much launched beer worldwide. So when I think about what goes on the plate, what's coming off the boats, what's coming out of the fields, I don't just think like a chef. I think like a brewer chef. For instance, one of the beers we have on the table is the Dam Buster Bock. The Dam Buster Weizenbock is it's a classic Weizenbock beer, but there is something interesting about it. It is the very first fresh from Florida beer.
Really?
It's made with red wheat, Russian soft winter red wheat that is grown at Murphy Farm in Jennings, Florida.
I really don't want to drink it. I just want to smell it all day. It's
Well,
so
of course,
good.
you've got the traditional banana close signature. Why did I do Weizenbock? I like Weizenbock as a beer style. Weizenbock is to Hefeweizen like IPA is to pale ale. It's just a stronger version. It's more suited in its natural palate expression to complement the seafood plates on the table. So we went with Weizenbock. It's rich, it's strong, it's spicy, it's strong in alcohol like IPA. So people who are somewhat IPA tired might be interested in the beer. And of course, it's proven to be successful as a result. We call it Dam Buster, DAM, because there was a conspiracy over 100 years ago to blow up the Hillsborough Reservoir Dam. 20 masked men took the dam. They put a box of explosives. They lit the fuse. Never blew up. They escaped into the night. Nobody ever confessed. It's still what you would call a cold case. Nobody's ever solved it. Not even on their deathbed. Isn't that amazing?
You would think somebody would say something.
Yeah. So I love the story because here we are. We're touching something historical. Why is that important to me? We're using ingredients fresh from Florida. We're making traditional beer. We're tying it to the region, directly to a story that not many people in the city of Tampa know about, but is absolutely amazing. You couldn't even write this as a fiction story. A story with no answers. And what a name.
No, absolutely. And it's interesting that you mentioned that because obviously the name and the story is absolutely wonderful, but you also have to have a beer to kind of back this up. And Tampa's not exactly a place that didn't know what beer was. This is one of the biggest markets in the state, if not the country. I hate to say it in a lot of ways. This is, Highlight built this city when it comes to the beers. So is there something, how was it stepping into those waters? Because while the menu is obviously new and the company is obviously storied for decades, people know beer here, and it's a very hop forward kind of beer that at least this area of Hillsborough County really likes to do. Was there a little bit of trepidation or research or what went into that to where you would fit in to Tampa's beer scene?
Well, when we first opened Ulele, we did not have IPA. We had a pale ale. I carried it for several years. It wasn't until I had people by the hundreds asking me to make IPA that I made one. And why? What did I make? I make what I like to call a Tampa style IPA. And people say, well, that beer description's not defined in the BJCP guidelines, is it? Well, who cares about them? I don't care about what the peer review says about anything. I know what is good and I know what is not. I know what has been historically significant to the region. The launching of High Life, for instance. What is High Life? High Life is a fantastic beer. It was revolutionary. It's a perfect example of Tampa IPA, and we have an equivalent called Green Cannonball. And what is it? It's so simple. West Coast meets East Coast with a kiss of malt. That covers a very broad category of different directions you could go. But at the end of the day, you want some of the determined bitterness of a West Coast IPA coupled with a secondary palate expression that's driven in fruit, hop driven, and a kiss of biscuit malt, like oxygen-starved malts, to give you a little bit of biscuit, bread, melanoidin. Some people can't get it because the bitterness is too high, but it's always there. If you drink the Cannonball and you wait 10 seconds, you get a little passionate kiss of that biscuit at the end, and that is well suited for the table. Plus, you want to, I also call it a 7.575. 7.5% alcohol by volume, approximately 75 IBUs. So when I take measure of the beers I'm making, and when I invented Green Cannonball, I thought, I don't want to make a beer like High Life. it's got to have its own expression. Of course, everybody has different hops. A lot of our hop schedule is very C-hop driven, like all the other beers. But there's something special about the Tampa IPA that helps qualify it for the table. And that's one of the reasons why Highlight became so expressive. It had a little bit of both.
The thing that I think was remarkable at the time is that, as Tim said, we didn't start out with an IPA. Tim was going more for lagers because everybody was going for ales. And so we were already zigging when everybody was doing the other. And the result was huge because I can't overstate the fact that the beers were meant to be paired. These were not punch you in the mouth, let me show you how stout I can make something, or be impressive on their own. These were made to be compatible with a wide range of foods, especially the seafoods on our menu, with the understanding that this is a warm weather place. And, that these are expressions more than they are anything else. And Tim talked about like the history behind the beers, but also a lot of what he uses for inspiration is the history that's similar to the history that we use on the rest of the menu. So it's not like we have the history on the menu and then it stops at the beers. It continues, and it's that added flavor that really nobody else has. One of the reasons that Highlight took off and all of the beers that Cigar City produced, my theory is because for the first time in decades, a Tampa story was leaving Tampa and going somewhere else, the way that like Hava Tampa Cigars did for decades and decades in the early part of the 1900s. Everybody on the East Coast had to figure out how to say Highlight to order it and what the hell Highlight was. And then came all the other beers that were sort of, and then you saw that replicated at Green Bench Brewing in St. Petersburg, where they took the Green Bench history and the history of St. Pete and started naming their beers. So it was really, we were a lot of ways very forward compared to a lot of other places in Florida and also in Tampa here at Ulele, because Tim understood the depth that the history can bring to his beers.
Absolutely. But you also, I was thinking about Highlight because we've got a plate of absolutely amazing calamari, but it's nicely flavored, but it's also delicate as calamari should be served. You pair this with Highlight, you taste Highlight, and that's it. Whereas the Weizenbach, while it does have some oomph behind it, I can still taste that for that. I can still taste this for this, and I can go between the two. So it's almost like, it's not that you couldn't brew a lot of these things. You could do a 12% imperial stout that you can use to, lubricate your car. But would that work here?
So the other thing I want to mention is Tim is also aware, I'm speaking for Tim as Tim's personal spokesman. I want to brag about Tim for a moment. He understands where this restaurant is, and it is on the Tampa Riverwalk. It's the only brewery on the Tampa Riverwalk. And as you can see from
Riverwalk, it goes from Armature Works all the way down.
It does. And then we're about to build a companion side on the western side of the Riverwalk that's going to go all through West Tampa as well. So it's the number one attraction in Tampa, more than Busch Gardens, more than anything else. It gets 1.5 million to 2 million people a year. Tim understands that. The first award-winning beer that he produced was the Hydration Station, which was a Mexican light lager, as he mentioned earlier. If you see where we're sitting here up on the second floor mezzanine, looking out on those windows, all the people who are walking or jogging or bicycling or paddleboarding, it's aimed at an active population. It's not just aimed at somebody who's going to sit there and drink and contemplate. This is a part of the lifestyle of Tampa now on the Tampa Riverwalk that adds to that lifestyle.
So that is it for part one of our two-part interview with Jeff and Tim, two of the amazing people from 1905 Family of Restaurants and Ulele. We will be back next week for part two. We're going to dive in a little bit more as to what they have to offer and actually some of the exciting things that they have coming up for the future of the restaurant. But first, if you have not done so, the best thing that you could do right now is to follow us on social media so you can find out everything that we have coming up. You'll see one of the beers that I was able to sample during our interview, and I also have a great video rundown of what Ulele looks like on social media. The best places to go would be to YouTube. I'm on there. You can go on to Instagram and Threads and Facebook and TikTok and basically just search up Florida Beer Blog. You'll find us very easily. The other thing that you want to do is to search up Florida Beer Podcast on the podcasting app of your choice. And we're on pretty much all of them, Apple and Spotify and iHeart. And you can even ask your smart speaker at home, hey, play the latest episode of the Florida Beer Podcast, and my voice will definitely come out soon enough, and you'll be able to hear everything that's going on. And if you are following us on a podcasting app, make sure to like us, make sure to subscribe so you know when the new episodes are coming out. And if you can, please give us a nice 5-star rating. That really does help us get the information out about the podcast and Florida's craft beer and craft community, because we got all sorts of fun stuff that are going to be coming up for you pretty soon. If you want to reach out to us, it's pretty easy. FloridaBeerBlog@gmail.com, or you can always send a message through any of those apps that we mentioned. And the other thing that you can do while you're there is to take a look at Flintstone Media. If you are interested in getting your own podcast off the ground, especially if you're a company that wants to create a podcast to support the community that you serve and to get the word out about the products and services that you offer, a podcast is the best place to do it. And Flintstone Media are the best people to help you realize that dream. And you can find them at flintstonemedia.com. Our intro announcer is Jeff Brozovich. Field producer is Steve Picala. Executive producer for Flintstone Media and Grand High Poobah is Jimmy Lagonier. This is David Butler, your host and author. We will see you next week with part 2 of Ulele. Thank you so much for listening, and drink Florida Craft.